The battle for holiness, why your flesh fears your spiritual transformation. There are battles every believer faces that cannot be explained by logic, psychology, or circumstance. They are wars that unfold in the invisible, fought between what God is awakening within you and what your flesh is terrified of becoming. Holiness is not merely a moral posture or a quiet virtue. It is an invasion from heaven into the territory of darkness that once claimed ownership over your desires, your identity, and your destiny. When holiness begins to rise, hell begins to react, not because it fears your behavior changing, but because it fears who you will become once the Spirit takes full dominion over your inner world. Your flesh does not fear church attendance, religious language, or spiritual appearance. It fears transformation. It fears the new creation God is birthing inside you. It fears the dismantling of the false self it has spent years constructing. That is why the pursuit of holiness feels like warfare. You are not merely resisting sin. You are resisting the old version of you that refuses to die. You are stepping into an internal revolution where grace confronts ego, truth confronts comfort, and destiny confronts habit. In this journey, your flesh will whisper, negotiate, distract, shame, accuse, and entice, not because it is powerful, but because it is desperately afraid of losing control. This message is not for those looking for surface religion. It is for those who sense that their spiritual life is shifting, that God is demanding deeper surrender, that battles intensify not because they are weak, but because they are being elevated. You are entering the battleground where holiness is no longer theory, but transformation. And in this confrontation, you will discover why your flesh fears your spiritual awakening more than anything in your life. The internal revolt. Why the flesh fears surrender. Holiness begins where human strength ends. It is not born from discipline alone, nor does it spring from morality, nor is it the product of religious performance. True holiness is the supernatural work of God, breaking open the walls of your inner kingdom and dethroning every rival authority within you. That is why your flesh despises holiness. It exposes counterfeit kingdoms. Holiness does not merely instruct behavior. It wages war against identity structures, emotional dependencies, coping patterns, and internal narratives built to protect the self rather than crucify it. Your flesh is not simply the lust of the body. It is the entire corrupted infrastructure of your fallen human nature. It is the self-preserving instinct that fears death, especially death to self. When God calls you to holiness, He is not asking you to modify habits. He is summoning you into surrender. And surrender is the most terrifying demand your flesh will ever encounter. Holiness threatens the flesh because holiness declares you are not your own. Your desires, your impulses, your pride, your comfort, your self-definition, your hidden motivations, your secret inner narratives, all of it must bow. The flesh fears this because it knows holiness is irreversible. You cannot unbecome awakened. Once God exposes truth, the old life cannot be reclaimed without agony. The flesh understands that holiness is not addition, but replacement. It does not coexist with the old self. It consumes it. This is why people can sit in churches for years without transforming. The flesh will gladly take religion, routine, inspiration, even spiritual language, as long as it does not require self-crucifixion. But when holiness begins to demand death to self, resistance rises. Suddenly, distractions multiply, fatigue intensifies, shame resurfaces, temptation amplifies. Why? Because the flesh is mobilizing its defense mechanisms to preserve its throne. Your flesh remembers something your spirit often forgets. Transformation is fatal to the old identity. Once you begin dying to self, The false you loses power, voice, control, justification, and pleasure. The flesh fears holiness because holiness exposes bondage disguised as personality. It reveals the coping mechanism behind your temper, the insecurity behind your ambition, the trauma behind your independence, the idolatry behind your desires, and the pride behind your morality. Holiness does not negotiate. Holiness disassembles. This is why spiritual awakening feels painful. God is not punishing you. He is dismantling you. He is killing what was killing you. He is tearing down structures that once protected dysfunction. He is stripping away identities built on survival, affirmation, reputation, performance, or fear. Holiness hurts only because you grew attached to what was killing you. When God confronts the flesh, you will feel friction inside. You will sense a war, clarity battling resistance, conviction battling rationalization, truth battling comfort. This internal revolt is the greatest evidence that holiness has begun working in you. The spiritual life is not quiet or sterile, it is violent, because something is dying and something is being born. Every time God calls you deeper, your flesh trembles, not because it doubts God, but because it knows you are on the verge of becoming who you were designed to be. Your destiny depends on whether you listen to discomfort or surrender to transformation. Holiness is proof that God is not leaving you where you are. If everything inside you feels shaken, dismantled, exposed, and challenged, rejoice, He is making you holy. And if this message speaks to you, if God is calling you deeper, if you feel the war within because He is awakening something eternal in you, then make sure you subscribe to this channel so you never miss what God is building in you. Your journey has just begun. The place where God breaks you to raise you. There comes a moment in every believer's journey where the pursuit of holiness ceases to be inspirational and becomes invasive. God, who once whispered encouragement, begins to speak with authority. The Spirit who once comforted begins to confront. Grace, which once felt like tender mercy, suddenly feels like a scalpel. This is where many believers draw back because they have not understood that before God transforms, He disassembles. Your flesh fears holiness because holiness requires exposure. It forces you into surrender you cannot negotiate. It calls you to abandon identities you built to survive, but not to live. It demands you relinquish memories you nurtured because they justified your wounds. Holiness reveals that your pain became a personality, your fear became identity, and your coping mechanisms became self-definition. God does not kill you to punish you. He kills what pretends to be you so that what truly belongs to Him can live. This stage is terrifying to the flesh because it is the beginning of death. In the breaking season, God allows contradiction. He lets prayers seem unheard so that motives are revealed. He lets old temptations resurface, not so you fall, but so you discover what was never healed. He lets discomfort push you into introspection. The flesh interprets this as abandonment. But the Spirit knows this is reconstruction. Holiness does not protect your comfort. It protects your destiny. And because transformation requires tearing down, the flesh panics. It tries to distract you, whispering that this is too painful, that it should not feel like this. It convinces you to withdraw from prayer, isolate yourself from truth, settle for survival instead of surrender. This is why so many believers remain spiritually stagnant, not because God is silent, but because they ran from His scalpel. In the breaking, you are introduced to the version of yourself you never wanted to admit existed. You see the pettiness hidden under politeness, the insecurity under confidence, the bitterness under righteousness, the pride under sacrifice. Holiness demands that you see these layers, not to shame you, but to liberate you. God reveals nothing He does not intend to heal. He exposes only what He has already planned to remove. Yet the flesh fears this process because exposure means accountability. When you finally see yourself, you cannot unsee it. When the Spirit illuminates your motives, you are forced to choose, deny them or surrender them. The flesh fears surrender because surrender means death. This inner confrontation is where the believer either evolves or collapses. Holiness refuses to flatter you. It does not soothe ego or reinforce identity. It dismantles it. It calls you to repentance even when you did not commit outward sin. It forces you to rethink your values, dismantle your ambitions, confess hidden rivalries with others, confront envy you masked as indifference, face self-pity, masquerading as humility. Holiness forces you to deal with wounds you spiritualized, unforgiveness you justified, jealousy you concealed under silence. God breaks you, not to shatter you, but to free you from the internal architecture that enslaved you while offering you the illusion of control. This death to self season is the crucible where true transformation begins. The flesh fears this because it fears being dethroned. It whispers that you are losing yourself, but in truth, you are finding who you were meant to be before the world rewrote you. The believer who allows God's breaking emerges with clarity, purity, and spiritual authority. They are no longer driven by validation, comparison, reaction, or insecurity. They become governed by the Spirit, not impulses. They speak less but see deeper. They need less attention because they have discovered presence. They desire less praise because they are anchored in identity. They resist less because they are possessed by surrender. This is the paradox of holiness. You are only made whole by being undone. God destroys what was destroying you, even if you were attached to it. He removes relationships that validated your dysfunction. He shuts doors that fueled your pride. He silences voices that fed your ego. He dries up resources that enabled your sin. To the flesh, this feels cruel. To the spirit, it is mercy disguised as loss. Holiness is surgical, not sentimental. God loves you too much to let you stay the version of yourself that was killing your destiny. As God breaks you, you learn that obedience is no longer convenient but costly. You learn to pray when you do not feel Him. You learn to stay when everything in you wants to run. You learn to obey when there is no reward. You learn to worship without goosebumps. You learn to love people who do not deserve it. You learn to forgive without apology. You learn to trust when outcomes contradict promises. You learn to surrender when nothing makes sense. This is where your flesh begins to die and your spirit begins to rule. Holiness is not a choir. It is a battlefield. It is where God takes your will and places His upon it like pressure. It is where you lose arguments with Him. It is where you lose the right to vindicate yourself. And if you stay, if you do not withdraw, something holy is born. If you feel broken now, if you feel confronted, exposed, or stripped, take heart. You are in the place where God remakes people. You are being undone so you can be reborn. Holiness hurts before it heals. But on the other side of breaking is authority, clarity, peace, spiritual weight, purity of sight, and intimacy with God that cannot be manufactured or imitated. If this speaks to you, if you sense God breaking and rebuilding you, then subscribe to this channel so you never walk this journey alone. Transformation has begun. The invisible war. When the spirit awakens and the flesh resists, there is a point in spiritual awakening where the battle ceases to be external and becomes painfully internal. You begin to realize that the real enemy was never the people who hurt you, the circumstances that oppressed you, or the attacks that frightened you. The greatest resistance to holiness is not demons outside, but the flesh within. It is the carnal nature that does not want to die, the corrupted self that fears surrender, the identity built from pain that refuses transformation. When God awakens your spirit, a civil war begins. What once felt normal suddenly feels uncomfortable. What once satisfied suddenly feels empty. What once controlled you suddenly feels exposed. This inner conflict is not dysfunction. It is evidence of resurrection. The flesh does not die quietly. It does not surrender politely. It erupts, demands, negotiates, accuses, distracts, and disguises itself as reasoning, self-protection, or emotional truth. You begin to sense a pull toward prayer but away from it, toward surrender but away from it, toward obedience but away from it. This friction is not a sign of failure, but of formation. Holiness feels like contradiction because something old is being buried and something eternal is trying to breathe. When the Spirit awakens, you become aware of thoughts you once entertained without discernment. You begin to notice attitudes that were invisible to you. You see motives behind actions that look noble. You see bitterness beneath silence, pride beneath kindness, fear beneath ambition. Awakening causes discomfort because God is shining light into rooms you closed. The flesh hates this illumination because truth is fatal to deception. Some believers run at this stage. They withdraw from intimacy with God, not because they do not love Him, but because they are startled by the intensity of His pursuit. Holiness is not God polishing you, it is God repossessing you. In this war, you discover that your flesh is religious. It will pray, worship, go to church, serve, and even sacrifice as long as it is not crucified. It wants God's benefits, but not His lordship. It wants spiritual identity without spiritual death. It wants forgiveness, but not transformation. It wants to feel holy, but not become holy. And when God demands the death of self, the flesh panics. It whispers that you are losing yourself, that God is stripping you unfairly, that you are being reduced. But God is not reducing you. He is revealing who you never were. The awakened spirit begins to hunger for purity, truth, and presence. Yet that hunger provokes warfare. Old desires intensify, not because you are regressing, but because the flesh is fighting extinction. Old wounds reappear so they can be healed. Old patterns resurface so they can be broken. Old identities emerge so they can be dethroned. This is why believers often feel worse before they grow. The flesh interprets healing as threat. The spirit sees it as liberation. Holiness requires confrontation. God confronts your dependence on control. He confronts the need for validation. He confronts the fear of surrender. He confronts the idol of your self-constructed personality. The flesh resists this because it has spent years surviving through dysfunction. To the flesh, surrender feels like destruction. But to the spirit, surrender is deliverance. God does not kill you. He kills what pretended to be you. This invisible war is where spiritual maturity is born. You learn to obey without understanding. You learn to resist temptation not because you have strength, but because weakness forces you to cling to God. You learn that holiness is not perfection, but partnership, a cooperation with the Spirit against yourself. You learn that righteousness is not behavior modification, but nature transformation. You learn that spiritual authority is not gifted, it is inherited through crucifixion. In this war, God teaches you to discern between conviction and condemnation, between temptation and invitation, between divine breaking and demonic accusation. The enemy accuses to shame you. The Spirit exposes to free you. The flesh resists because it cannot survive exposure. The more God awakens you, the more you begin to recognize the difference between your voice, the enemy's voice, and the Spirit's voice. This clarity is terrifying to the flesh because deception is the flesh's oxygen. At this stage, prayer becomes warfare. Worship becomes surrender. Silence becomes surgery. Waiting becomes trust. Holiness becomes the lens through which everything is interpreted. You begin to see that sin is not merely violation, but misalignment. You begin to see that obedience is not duty, but alignment. You begin to see that consecration is not restriction, but protection. You begin to realize that holiness is God reclaiming His image within you. If you feel torn inside, if obedience feels costly, if surrender feels dangerous, if your flesh is loud and your spirit is restless, then you are not failing. you are transforming. The war is proof that you are not dead inside. The battle is proof that God is working. When everything in you screams to withdraw, that is often the moment you are closest to breakthrough. Press on, because the very resistance you feel is the territory God is reclaiming. And if this resonates with you, if you sense God awakening a deeper call in you, if you are in the war between flesh and spirit, then subscribe to this channel so you do not walk this journey alone. What God is doing in you deserves to be fed, strengthened, and guided. Subscribe so you never miss a word that confirms, confronts, and carries your transformation forward. The cost of holiness. What you must lose to become who you were born to be. There is a moment in every believer's journey when God stops asking politely and begins requiring sacrifice. At first, holiness feels like inspiration, revelation, illumination, but eventually it becomes separation. God begins removing things you once enjoyed, people you once depended on, places you once sought refuge in, identities you once assumed were permanent. This is why holiness terrifies the flesh. It is not addition, but subtraction. It is not improvement, but replacement. To be made holy, something in you must be dismantled, something must be surrendered, something must die. And the flesh fears this because the flesh fears becoming nothing. Holiness always brings loss before gain. It takes your illusions before it gives you truth. It takes your comfort before it gives you strength. It takes your pride before it gives you authority. It takes your independence before it gives you intimacy. Most believers are willing to follow God as long as it does not cost them what they cling to. But God does not negotiate destiny around your attachments. When holiness arrives, it demands lordship. Everything that rivals his rule must go. This phase of transformation feels confusing. You begin to lose appetite for what others still crave. You feel distanced from conversations that once defined you. You cannot tolerate certain environments anymore. God closes doors you would have entered, silences voices you would have listened to, blocks opportunities you assumed you needed. The flesh interprets this as rejection. The spirit recognizes it as preparation. Holiness must isolate you so it can identify you. God cannot anoint who you pretend to be. He can only sanctify the version of you he actually created. The cost of holiness is not primarily behavioral, but existential. You lose the life you constructed without God. You lose identities that made you feel safe. You lose narratives that excused your brokenness. You lose relationships built around dysfunction rather than purpose. You lose desires you nurtured because they validated your wounds rather than your calling. Holiness does not strip you randomly. It dismantles strategically. Everything God takes is something that cannot go with you into the version of you he is forming. This is why many believers get stuck. They want the transformation without the transaction. They want resurrection without crucifixion, authority without obedience, clarity without surrender, intimacy without death to self. But God will not permit spiritual maturity without sacrifice. You cannot hold on to the flesh and walk in the spirit at the same time. Something must die for something greater to live. In this season, God will ask for what feels irreplaceable. He will ask you to let go of rights that seem justified. Your right to be offended, your right to be understood, your right to be vindicated, your right to be comfortable. He will call you to forgive betrayal without closure, to release wounds without apology, to walk in love toward those who hurt you, to obey without reward, to sacrifice without applause. The flesh despises this because the flesh feeds on self-preservation. But the spirit thrives on surrender. God is not tormenting you. He is training you. He is removing the internal scaffolding of your old nature so his nature can anchor you. Holiness requires that you lose certainty. There will be seasons where God says, "Go," without telling you where. Seasons where he says stay without telling you why. Seasons where he says trust me while allowing confusion to remain. In these moments, the flesh panics because it cannot control the outcome. But this is precisely the point. Holiness is not God making you better. It is God making you dependent. There is also a social cost. As you grow, you will notice that some people cannot go with you. You will lose companions of comfort so you can encounter companions of calling. The ones who fed your ego will fade. The ones who reinforced your excuses will distance themselves. God protects your destiny by subtracting people whose presence threatens it. The flesh hates this loneliness, but loneliness is often God's classroom. You learn to hear him without filters, to cling to him without alternatives, to discover who you are without reflection through others. The greatest cost of holiness, however, is internal, the surrender of the false self. You must let God rewrite your identity. You must lose the version of yourself built on trauma, survival, performance, intelligence, or rebellion. You must allow him to strip labels you embraced because they made you feel safe or superior. Holiness is the undoing of every identity that is not rooted in Christ. And when that false self dies, you grieve, not because God is cruel, but because you thought that version of you was real. Holiness hurts because the part of you dying once felt like you. Yet if you stay and surrender long enough, something extraordinary emerges. You begin to feel lighter, freer, quieter inside. You become less reactive, less defensive, less easily offended. You do not need attention. You do not need validation. You are no longer driven by fear or comparison. You begin to live from a place of eternal security rather than emotional survival. This is what holiness births, the restoration of your original design. If you are in this phase where God is taking things, pruning you, isolating you, exposing you, or asking you to surrender what you cherished, take heart. You are not being reduced, you are being rebuilt. Holiness costs you what was enslaving you, and though it feels like death, it is actually liberation. If this speaks to the season you are in, if you feel God stripping you so he can sanctify you, then make sure you subscribe to this channel so you never walk this journey alone. Your transformation deserves guidance, confirmation, and strength. Subscribe now so your spirit continues to be fed while God continues to remake you. The rising of the new man. When holiness becomes identity and not effort. There is a point in the journey where holiness stops feeling like struggle and starts feeling like nature. What once required force becomes instinct. What once felt like loss becomes liberation. What once demanded obedience becomes delight. This is the moment when the flesh finally weakens enough for the spirit to rule without constant resistance. It does not mean you are flawless or temptation ceases. It means the axis of your inner world has shifted. Your will has bowed. Your identity has been rewritten. And what God desires no longer feels foreign to you. This is the realm where holiness is no longer something you pursue, but something you embody. The old you died slowly, painfully, gradually but surely, and the new creation rises, not as theory, but as existence. At this stage, sin no longer seduces you the way it did, because your appetites have changed. You begin to love purity because your soul can finally breathe. You begin to value obedience because disobedience feels suffocating. You begin to savor surrender because self-rule now feels like imprisonment. The Spirit's voice becomes familiar, and his presence becomes necessity. You no longer need external validation. Your security comes from alignment. Holiness becomes less about fighting old battles and more about stewarding the inner peace God has installed within you. This transformation is subtle but profound. You think differently. Not because you discipline your thoughts, but because your mind has been renewed. You feel differently, not because you suppress emotion, but because your heart has been reformed. You choose differently, not because you fear punishment, but because you love righteousness. This is where sanctification becomes identity. You are no longer behaving holy, you are becoming holy. You are no longer visiting surrender, you are living surrendered. The flesh still whispers occasionally, but it no longer governs. Temptation may appear, but it lacks authority. Your reactions change. You forgive quickly because bitterness feels foreign. You confess quickly because hiding feels toxic. You love without effort because defense mechanisms have died. You stop performing because the audience of one is enough. You no longer strive to earn God's approval. You rest in belonging. Holiness has moved from warfare to habitation. This is the mystery of spiritual transformation. God does not fix the old man, he replaces him. The believer often imagines holiness as self-improvement when, in truth, holiness is self-removal. God never intended to refine the flesh, he intended to crucify it. The new man is not an upgraded version of the old. It is an entirely different nature awakened in you by the Spirit. You begin to sense this when you feel impulses that were once natural now feel alien. When behaviors you once excused now feel unacceptable. When desires you once nurtured now feel incompatible with who you are becoming. At this stage, suffering becomes teacher instead of obstacle. Delays become formation rather than punishment. Loneliness becomes intimacy rather than abandonment. You realize nothing God allowed was wasted. Every loss was preparation. Every breaking was purification. Every silence was instruction. You begin to thank God for the things he refused to give you and the people he refused to let stay. Holiness has given you sight, and sight allows you to interpret life through eternity rather than emotion. The new man is marked by stillness, not apathy, but anchoredness. The noise around you no longer becomes the noise within you. You are not easily moved, tempted, offended, or manipulated. You carry spiritual weight, not because you try to be strong, but because surrender has made you unshakable. Holiness stabilizes you. It quiets the war within. It dethrones fear. It silences insecurity. It ends the need to prove yourself. You are finally at peace because you are finally possessed by God. This does not mean the battle is over, only that the outcome is decided. The flesh may whisper, but the Spirit now reigns. The enemy may attack, but authority now governs you. You are not simply surviving, you are becoming. And the more you become, the more holiness begins to radiate through you without conscious effort. Your presence convicts others. Your words carry weight. Your silence speaks louder than your opinions. Your life becomes testimony, not by force, but by transformation. This is why holiness was worth the pain, worth the breaking, worth the isolation, worth the surrender. The you who emerges after dying to self is nothing like the you that resisted God. The old nature fought holiness because it feared extinction. But what rose in its place is stronger, purer, freer, more stable, more eternal. The flesh feared holiness because holiness is the restoration of the version of you that hell always feared. If you feel this transformation unfolding in you, if you sense God rewriting you, if you feel less resistant and more surrendered than before, then you are stepping into the rise of the new man. The journey is not finished, but the shift has begun. God did not break you to abandon you. He broke you to inhabit you. He is forming someone who can carry him, reflect him, and reveal him in the earth. And if this final chapter speaks to your spirit, if you recognize yourself in this process, then subscribe to this channel. You are not meant to walk this alone. There are deeper things God wants to reveal to you, confront in you, and awaken within you. Subscribe now so your spirit continues to be fed, strengthened, and guided with every new word that God gives.